Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you all for the opportunity. To be with you today in worship. A wonderful worship service. I love the music. Just a wonderful, wonderful morning. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. And I thank you for your time here and for the opportunity to share a little bit about stewardship. So Anne mentioned some of my background. I have an undergraduate degree in finance. I work in the finance industry. I've been an associate pastor in Georgia, senior pastor in Florida, pastor in Anaheim, and then recently started up here back in October as the general presbyter for Santa Barbara Presbytery. I have a dual interest in both finance and in faith, and throughout my career I've kind of jumped back and forth and really interested in the intersection between faith and finances. I have served on various finance committees at the presbytery level, endowment committees, and serve on a national level endowment committee for the PCUSA right now. So I enjoy finance. I enjoy the numbers. I enjoy spreadsheets and budgets and income statements. I think they have a story to tell if you can read them, and I enjoy kind of nerding out on those things. This is another area of finance and faith, though, is stewardship. Especially back when I was a senior pastor in Florida, we really revamped the stewardship program that congregation was doing. I took a course through the, I forget what it's called now. It's with Indiana University. They have an associated degree program for nonprofits that's funded by the Lilly Endowment. And so I took a faith and finances course through that in a way of helping to kind of revamp that church in Florida's stewardship program. And then from there, I just kind of got interested in it and kept gathering resources and reading stuff on stewardship and finance and stewardship within the congregation. And so what I'm sharing with you today is kind of some of that course material from the Lilly Endowment Fund, and then some other resources that I've put together. One that I'll start with, I mentioned in my sermon this morning, it's the book, The Spirituality of Fundraising is the book by Henry Nouwen. It's a green little book. It's only like 50 pages, but it's a wonderful book to read through if you really want to get an idea of how not only is stewardship a spiritual thing, but also fundraising and asking people, inviting people to be generous to the church is an act of spirituality. And he argues is as inviting people to give to the ministry is as spiritual as praying for people, as spiritual as giving a sermon. So that's kind of what underlies this whole presentation. This book here, The Ransom of the Soul by Peter Brown from Princeton University, he looks at the afterlife and wealth in early Western Christianity. But he has this interesting quote here. He says, "Faith and money lie at the core of all religious institutions. While faith can exist without money, religious institutions cannot." And so one important thing about having stewardship in the church is to have a solid theology of stewardship, or theology of money, theology of finances. One way we can find this is St. Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers. He says that riches then are not to be thrown away. They are possessions and goods. They lie in our hand and are put under our power as material and instruments, which are for good use to those who know the instrument. If you use it skillfully, it is skillful. Such an instrument is wealth, and are you able to make right use of it? I think as we build on this theology of money, we'll get in a couple more slides. I think one of the things that I often heard growing up, I don't know if it was in my particular context or elsewhere, but I've heard it elsewhere in the church too, I think, is that there's a sense that wealth is bad. We often think of the thing that it's easier to put a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. So there's this kind of sense that wealth in a sense is bad. But I think he's making a good point here that wealth in itself is not bad. Wealth is an instrument. And how we use that instrument determines the good or the not good of that instrument. So money is a gift of God, and then therefore is not intrinsically evil. Like all other gifts, money and property are to be used in freedom for the service of God and the salvation of humankind. The paradox of Christian stewardship is that the God who became incarnate in Jesus Christ and required that he alone be worshipped and served demanded this allegiance for the sake and service of the needy world. So as Christian stewards generously use and give away their possessions for the well-being of others, they become superior to money and property as possessions, become a way of ministering everlasting life. And the Christian steward manages money and property in such a way as to be able to be cheerful mind, bear their loss equally with their abundance that they receive from giving away. Our own John Calvin also had some things to say about money. Whether you like him or not, I don't tell anybody in my seminary, but I had problems with him at first. I did not like what he had to say, but I came to really understand what he was getting to. But he's an interesting guy. But he says, the topic is a slippery one. The topic of money is a slippery slope on both sides into error. So let this be our principle, therefore, that the use of God's gifts is not wrongly directed when it is referred to the end for which the author himself created for us, for our good and not for our ruin. So again, he's building on the idea here that money itself, wealth itself, possessions in themselves, are not intrinsically good or evil. They are a gift, an instrument to be used by us in service of God, and how we use those determines their worth. So that's a quick theology of money and possessions. We could get more into that further, but that's kind of where we're going to leave that for now. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to share some background information to kind of help to set the scene of what stewardship looks like in the United States today. And then that'll be about for the next, half a dozen slides or so. And then we'll go into basically a series of slides that are a bunch of questions for us to ponder. What I've put together, building on and drawing from the work of lots of people, is something called a resource for stewardship, or a stewardship guidebook. What it's to be used for is if congregations want to re-examine their own stewardship and how they do stewardship in their congregations, this resource gives congregations a concept, questions to ask to walk through in order to fill that out. And we're going to go through a lot of those questions today. We won't answer them, of course, but they're kind of helping reflect and kind of fill out this new sense of stewardship. So this is annual giving, individual giving as a percentage of disposable income from 1973 to 2013. This is for that time period. And you can see there is some fluctuation. It goes from 2.1% of total income goes to giving, down to, in some years, 1.9%. But then it goes back up to 2.1%. This only goes to 2013, but some of the numbers I've shown from 2013 and updated doesn't change a whole lot. So Americans' giving as a percentage of their income has been remarkably steady and unchanging. Yes?
Is this Christians or is this general population?
This is individual population.
Okay. And the research that I read for Christians, it's been pretty steady at about 2.5%.
Yeah, it's
over time.
interesting.
So kind of a far cry from tithing.
Yes.
I'm trying to read the top line. It's obscure, but I think I see the word religious.
Yeah, it's religious giving to all Americans, not just necessarily Christians.
Thank you, Jason.
Certainly. As we know, many congregations have experienced a decline in the difference between income and expenses, or a decline even in income. Some of the reasons are because of the declining population in congregations. Churches are getting smaller. But here's another thing that factors in that we often don't think about. This is religious. This is percent of registered religious organizations from 1995 to 2010. So how many religious organizations are out there asking people to give from that same 1.9 to 2.1%? You can see that is significantly growing. So there are more asks of the same people who are giving of the same funds. So that's another piece in this puzzle of why income in congregations is steady or declining. It's not just the decline in numbers, but this also plays a factor into that as well. So this is looking a bit more at religious Americans in particular. But 1 out of 5 American Christians give nothing to church, parachurch, or non-religious charities. The mean donation of Protestant households in 1998 is about $1,800. It's increased a little bit if you factor in inflation, but not very much. The inflation numbers show that most congregations have not kept pace with inflation. So this number has not gone up at the same rate of inflation. I think if your congregation, from what the figures I know, I could be wrong, yours is a little bit higher than that mean, but I could be wrong. And then $224 is the median that Protestant households give to charity in 1998. And those numbers have gone up a little bit with inflation, but not nearly enough to keep pace with inflation. 1.5 is the average increase of inflation-adjusted giving. Inflation averages about 3% per year, so this has only gone up about 1.5%. So the next two slides, I think, are probably the most important two slides of the presentation. So on the left-hand side, we have what people are calling the old paradigm of stewardship in the congregation. On the right-hand side, we have, this calls it the emerging paradigm, but I would say that it was emerging probably 8, 9, 10 years ago, and that now it is the model that churches who are successful at stewardship are using this emerging paradigm that's on the right. So the first one is there's a shift from a moral obligation to give focused on donor cultivation. So what is a moral obligation to give? It is messages we hear in the church such as God requires us to give to the church, we should give to the church. We have a moral obligation as Christians to give to the church. Or if it's not just in church, it's that as a good citizen in the United States, you have a moral obligation to give to a nonprofit to support its work. So that's kind of the old paradigm. The new paradigm is focusing on donor cultivation. We'll talk a bit more about donor cultivation, but it's very much focused on the individual donor. I'd say it's focused on the relationship between the organization and the donor. Next one is the theology of duty. It's pretty similar to the same one, but as the previous one, but there's a theology that we are given something and we are required to give of that something back to the church or back to God. And that is being replaced with a theology of grace, focusing on the sense that what God has given to us freely, with no obligations, no expectations, and we are invited to respond to God's grace to us by giving generously back to God and to others. It's a slight shift. It's not huge, but there is a difference between, is this our duty, or is this something that we get to participate in as a response to God's grace to us? I would argue there's more joy in this theology of grace than there is in the theology of duty. The old model, the old paradigm was institution-centered, and the new paradigm is donor-centered. So the institution-centered would be things like the church has set this budget. This is what the church's budget is for the year. We need people to help support this church's budget for this year. Or things like this is the ministry that the church is engaged in. These are the funds that it takes to fund that ministry. We need you to give to these funds to this organization and this ministry to help that. It's true. I mean, it still seems to be true, but the donor-centered is more focused on, we'll get to see it a bit more in a minute, is inviting the donor to participate in that mission. And one of the ways they participate in that mission is through giving of their time, talents, treasures, passions, energy. So it's not so much that here's what the church is doing, here's what our ministry is doing, we need you to come and support us in this ministry. It is, here's the vision that we see God is calling us to. Would you like to be a part of this and join us in this ministry? Subtle difference, but it's a very important one. So we've heard a lot. We've heard a lot about how institutions broadly are no longer trusted, or there's a decline in the trust of institutions. Not only the church, but all kinds of institutions, from the Supreme Court to city organizations to any kind of organizations, decline of organizations and institutions. And that the old model had a thing that the default is that organizations and institutions can be trusted. They're reliable, they're faithful, we can trust them. Now it is that institutions have to earn that trust. How are we as the church, as an institution, how are we earning people's trust? We cannot take it for granted that they're going to trust us just because we are an organized church. But what are we doing to build that trust? And some of the questions we'll walk through in a few minutes focus on how we as a church can foster trust and gain that trust. The old paradigm is that institutions are autonomous. So similar to what we talked about before, the church has this budget. So the church, as it's an autonomous thing, has this budget, and this is what we're going to do. But again, donors are collaborative partners. So here's the vision that we see God is calling us to. You as a donor, we want you to be a part of this vision. What are you seeing God calling us to in this vision? How can we partner with you to bring about this vision, not just the church as its autonomous thing? Again, budgets are need-driven. So here's our expenses as a church for the year. These are the needs that we have. We need you as donors to give to these needs that the church has. The new paradigm is that giving is value-driven. So it's figuring out, what do our donors, what do our congregants, what do our friends, what do they value? Do they value missions? Do they value pastoral care? What do they value, and how can we as an institution, as the church, listen to what people, our own people, what we ourselves are passionate about, what we value? How can we hear in their words what God is calling all of us together to do? Financial focus is insular, so focused on what we ourselves can do, what our own programs focus more on what is God calling us to do in the world around us. I'll also say it's a missional focus, not just global. Giving is, the old paradigm is giving as a contribution. So I'm contributing something, it's very transactional. I'm giving something to an organization and giving something to the church, where in the new paradigm, the focus is on the outcome. So we are giving because we are creating change. We're not just giving because we're giving to something. Why are we giving? What do we feel that God is calling us to do with this in order to bring about change in the world, to bring about that good news through our contributions of our time, talents, and treasures? Next one, the old model is that fundraising is raising money. Here's our goal. We have the thermometer. We're trying to raise money to fill up that thermometer till it gets to the top. The new model is that fundraising is nurturing generosity. Generosity, as I kind of mentioned in the sermon this morning, it's much, much more about just giving of time, talents, and treasures. It's a whole way of being, that we feel that there is generosity, that there is no way that we can hold on to what we have. It just kind of, it's like trying to capture water in a sieve. It just falls through. But only in giving away is where we actually find life. The first one is income sources are limited, is the old model. The new emerging paradigm is that income sources are diverse. There's a lot of different ways we could go with this, but it's realizing that becoming a bit more creative in funding sources. There are churches that are drawing not only from contributions from their endowments and their annual giving, but how come they're partnering with other institutions to tap into their sources of funding to work on ministries that kind of have that the church believes is in God's calling to the church, but also another organization has some funds that are available to fund those types of things, such as our denomination has some grants that are available for institutions, things like that. The old model is the gift as an end to philanthropy. So there's a view that once the church has received the gift, we've been successful in what we're trying to do because we have gotten somebody to give to the church. And the second one is that, the emerging one is a gift as a means to philanthropy. So that giving, it's more of this kind of idea that generosity is a lifestyle. It's not just an act that we do. We're not generous when we give something, and that's the end. But generosity encompasses all of who we are, how we live our lives, how we share of our resources, how we interact with people, how we view the world. It's much more kind of broad. The old model is different from business. I've heard this. This one's always an interesting one for me because my undergraduate degree is in business, finance, and I am an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church. But I understand this. There's a lot of talk about how the church is different from a business. The church is not a business. And I understand that. I agree. The church is not a business. But the church, if it chooses to exist as an institution, it is an institution. And so we have to think institutionally. Like the first slide, this says, faith can exist without an organization, but an organization cannot exist. I can't remember what it was. I messed it up now. But so if our faith, if the institution of the church dies, our faith does not die. But if we're going to be an institution, if we choose to express our faith as an institution, as an organization, then we have to spend some time, not all the time, thinking in some ways that are similar to other organizations. We're not just an organization, we're not just a business, but if we're going to exist as a corporate body in this form, we have to think somewhat of business principles and practices. So this is kind of a summary of the previous. Fundraising as ministry, excuse me, or a new way, this new model of ministry, is that fundraising is not a response to a crisis. It's not saying, we have a budget, we're short of our budget, it's a crisis, we need your help. The new model is not that. What it is, it's a way of announcing our vision. Here's what we as the leadership of this church have discerned through prayer, discussion, involvement. This is our vision that we believe God is calling this church to go to. And we are inviting you to be a part of this vision. All of the entirety of you, not just your money. We're not just inviting your money to be a part of this vision where we think God's calling us, but we're inviting you as a person. All that you are, your money, your passions, your interests, your ideas, we're inviting you to be a part of this vision that we believe is God is calling us to do. So the next slides we're going to go into, I'll do this one too, I forgot this one was here. So part of this too is that fundraising and stewardship is deeply tied to vision and mission of the congregation. If you don't have a vision and a mission, you're not going to be able to invite people into that, and people are not going to be able to join with you in that. So this one, it says, is a hedgehog concept, where there's one circle, what are we deeply passionate about? So what are we as a congregation, as a group of people, what are we deeply passionate about? What are we the best at? So where do we think that God has given us the skills and the resources, the people, the passions? What do we think that God, because each congregation is different. Each congregation has a different skill set, things that it's good at. Each congregation has things they're deeply passionate about. What one congregation is passionate about, others may not be. And then the third one is what drives our resource engine. And where the true mission and progress should be would be in the middle of those overlapping of those three. So let me make sure, oops. Oh yeah, so I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions, comments, discussion that you would all like to share on kind of the old paradigm versus the emerging paradigm before we move into some of the others. The next section will be kind of questions that I'll just basically ask of us to help us flesh out what this emerging paradigm looks like and how we as a congregation might be able to bring about that new paradigm. So any questions, comments before we move on?
I think I can project, but thank you. Other people, okay. My question is, are there examples of congregations or institutions within our PCUSA body that have made this transition or are well on their way?
Yes, there are some. I think the last three slides, I'm not sure if they'll work because of the computer thing, but the last three slides, I'll bring up some examples, and then I can, if they're not going to work on the computer, I could tell you about them and share about where you can find some more. So yes. And actually, I'll share in a minute, but I think there's some things that you all are doing that are on this new way. So.
Jason, are you going to make the slides available to all of us?
Sure, I can do that. Mm-hmm. And I'll also share the next couple slides are taken from this stewardship resource roadmap, and I'd be happy to share that with you all. So if you decide as a congregation you want to walk through that, you can. So yes. Yes.
It seems like a great deal of this, to translate it into something effective, comes back to communication and a communication plan.
Yes.
And that, I hope you're going to talk about that.
I am, yes. Yep. Very good insight, yep. Okay, well, we'll move on. Okay, so these next slides are basically, there's the stewardship roadmap that I have, the resource I'd be happy to share with you, basically walks through these next few areas. The way it's structured out is there's a topic. So here it is, is there a defined stewardship theology? This slide is going to show you what that means, and the next slide is going to ask some questions for a church to ponder. Do we have a defined stewardship theology in the congregation? Okay, so defined stewardship theology. So growing a stewardship culture requires a stewardship language. While the language interpretation may vary from church to church, it is critical to have a clear language that cultivates meaningful discourse about stewardship. If a church has no language for stewardship, then how can the church have meaningful conversations about it? If a church does not have defined beliefs about stewardship, then how can we lead people to become good stewards? So here are a series of questions that if you decided to, if you want to move forward with this, your leadership or focus groups or whatever, however you want to do it, these are questions that could help you understand and flesh out this question. So what does this church believe about stewardship? Biblically, corporately, individually, and practically. How does the church define good stewardship? Is there a consistent preaching message about stewardship? Does the church intentionally and consistently create opportunities to teach about stewardship? Does the church intentionally teach that good stewardship is a part of spiritual formation of the whole person? Can members of the congregation, not just the pastor, not just the leadership, but others in the congregation, can they articulate the church-wide beliefs on stewardship? Does your staff and lay leaders practice what the church believes about stewardship? Are they expected to? Does the church intentionally teach new members about its stewardship beliefs and expectations? Does the church as an organization itself practice good stewardship? If we as an institution are not being good stewards, how can we expect those members and friends of our institution to be good stewards themselves? And how does your church talk about stewardship and money? Does it talk in terms of obligations and expectations? Does it talk about it in terms of guilt and wealth is bad, or that wealth is a good blessing from God and generosity? What kind of language exists in your congregation regarding money? Annual giving. Did I skip one? I guess not. So annual giving, is there a communicated and common church vision that is embraced by the congregation? So that's going back to mission and vision. Is there a clear mission and vision of the congregation where we believe God is calling us? Is that articulated well? Does the church present a ministry plan to achieve that vision? If the slides work in a few minutes, I'll show you what that might look like in detail. But is there a ministry plan? Here's where we think God is going, calling us. Here's how we think we're going to get there. And this is what we are inviting you to be a part of. Are ministry priorities and initiatives communicated, and do people understand the practical impact of their giving? These are kind of two. I separate those two out. But first one is, are ministry priorities and initiatives communicated? This is an extremely difficult one. If you discover how to solve this, let me know, because I'd love to know. But in the church, everything is important. But we can't do everything. So we need to give more money to the youth. We need to give more money to missions. We need to give more money to worship. It's all important. It's all great. It's all wonderful. But we can't do everything. So how do we prioritize things in terms of where we think God is calling the congregation? That's difficult. And do people understand the practical impact of their giving? Do they understand that what they're giving actually matters to the congregation? What impact does it have? We'll come back to that some more too. How often does the church share progress of its investments in ministry? Anne did this wonderfully this morning when she was sharing about, thank you for your giving this morning. Your giving goes to support these, the worship, the music that we have in Sunday mornings, the worship, the technology. That's a way of sharing the progress and investments in ministry. They're saying, you have given to this congregation, thank you for giving. Here's what it did. This is what we were able to do because of your gift. Is there a strategy to cultivate the different constituencies within the church, such as leadership gifts, cultivation, newer members, non-givers, and sporadic givers, not just the core group? Yes?
You skipped 4.
I skipped 4. Where's number 4? Oh, how open is information? I skipped over something that should be about being open. How open is information about the church's stewardship of gifts and management of its ministry plan? This goes to the issue earlier, is that institutions cannot be assumed to be trusted. Institutions have to earn trust. One of the most important things in earning trust is clarity, is information sharing, it's disclosures, it's being open. That's a critical thing. Thank you, Chuck. Does the church open various paths for giving? Not all of us have the same resources, the same capabilities, but are there different paths that people can take? Not just in terms of money, but in terms of their leadership gifts, their personalities, their interests, their connections, their social connections. This is an interesting one, and this one is a controversial one in congregations. It's about leadership gift cultivation. So in most churches, 1/3 of the congregation's total giving potential resides in relatively few families or donors. How does the church identify, engage, and cultivate these families or donors that have the gift of financial leadership? I like that last phrase there because we often talk about gifts of music, gifts of teaching, gifts of preaching, gifts of pastoral care. Gift of financial leadership, I think, is also a gift that some people have been given that are able to give back to the church or to God through the church. So these are some questions. Does the church maintain a database of leadership gifts and leadership gift prospects? Does the church consistently and effectively identify new leadership gift prospects? Does the church provide ongoing access to key church staff for these leaders? Does the church intentionally engage these leaders in discipleship opportunities such as small groups? Does the church create consistent, intimate forums for these leaders to discover vision and provide feedback for mission and ministry? Does the church say thank you enough? I think that comes up again later, but that is a crucial one, is the thank you. I've been taught that you have to say thank you at least 7 times before you ask again. So when someone gives you a gift, you have to say thank you to that person at least 7 times before you come back and ask for another gift. Does the church regularly communicate? Communication was mentioned earlier. To donors, the impact and successes of giving in a direct way. Does the church ask for leadership gifts personally and directly? This is one that many churches feel uncomfortable with. And I mean, I don't know the culture of your congregation as well. I'm not saying that always have to apply to every congregation. There's going to have to be some things. But I found that, in my experience at least, many churches are afraid to ask for leadership gifts personally and directly from those who have the potential for being a financial leader in their congregation. Very controversial. Curious to hear what you think. But does the church have a strategy based on donor interests on when to ask and who to ask for specific ministry investments? That one I've seen used well, and I've seen it also go south. One of the ways that it goes south is that people are asked to give to a specific ministry the church is using, but then the church giving starts to become siloed. So people will give to this or this program, but they won't give to the general operating fund, which makes all of this possible. The church in Florida, there was a person on the finance committee. I loved her because she said, when she dies, she's going to give an endowment for the heater, because it was always breaking. And always breaking. She didn't like being cold, but nobody wanted to give to fix the heater in the basement of the congregation. They wanted to give to youth and to children and to the music and to the organ, but she said, none of this is possible if we're all sitting in a sanctuary shivering and can't listen because we're so cold. So she wanted to endow the heater. Core cultivation. So every church has an influential core in their congregation, the functional and financial leaders of the church. They are the 20% who are involved in 80% of the church's ministry. Teachers, small group leaders, ministry volunteers, board, committee elders, deacons, and consistent givers. 20% of the people do 80% of the work of the congregation. The core group extends beyond the few people who might be elected or designated as the official structural straight leaders, so as the session or deacons. For any initiative into the church to be widely successful, this core group has to understand, embrace, and advocate for that initiative. Now, this is speaking more broadly than just money. If you have a new kind of vision or mission that you're trying to put forward, if this influential core, the 20%, doesn't understand it, buy into it, support it, be involved in it, it's not going to be successful. So how is the vision and calling of the church presented to and embraced by this core group? Maybe small focus groups, small discussion groups, home groups, It's a way to get this core's input and involvement and engagement. How does the core group engage in discussion about ministry and mission? Is the future and vision of the congregation decided just by the session or deacons or some other group? Or is this core group, this larger core group, involved in that decision-making process, even if they're not currently serving on the session? Does the church provide ongoing training and leadership development for its core group? That's a difficult one in many congregations. Is the core group mobilized to become mission and vision and ministry advocates to the congregation? So if you can get buy-in from the core group, how are they encouraged and supported and resourced to share that more broadly with the rest of your congregation and friends? What are expectations of people in the core group, and are they well defined? This is an interesting one beyond just fundraising. I've seen some congregations, not many, but some, who have very clear expectations of various entities in the church. Sometimes it's like we have, for our members of the congregation, this is what we expect you to do. This is what we hope you will do. Or even job descriptions for committees, I think is a great one too. So as a committee, here is your job description. Here's what session leadership, the church, wants and expects and hopes from this particular committee. How does the church intentionally groom people in the congregation to become core members? So the key word there is intentionally. Are people encouraged to be more involved? Is there an intentional way, a process, a system of making people become more involved in this core group and inviting others in? I mean, one thing you want to avoid as well is the cliquishness. Sometimes the core can become cliquish, and that is not a good thing either. You want the core to be involved and engaged, but you want the borders of that core to be porous, so that other people are invited into becoming a part of this core group of the congregation. And the other way it can go south, I'm going away from finances again, but the other way it can go south is if this core group becomes more influential than the official session or deacons of the congregation. That can be a problem too that you have to watch out for. So the point here is not that there's a core group that's in a closed room making decisions for the whole congregation, but it is a vision that the session is crafting with input from the core group and others more broadly, so that we are doing this together. But the core group are the ones who are going to be most involved in volunteering their time, their talents, their resources, and so it's important that these people are brought in on this. Yes?
I understand this concept of 80% of the work done by 20% and this core group. What I'm struggling with is how do you communicate separately with this group? It almost seems like you're creating an elitist group, and as you described a little bit, there's some downsides to that. But how do you, are you proposing that there be a separate specific communication mechanism and training or committee groups of that 20%?
I'll give you an example. I don't know if this is the best way to go about it, but it's the way that we did it when I was in Florida, is that we're embracing a new vision called Vision 2020. Very creative, I know. But we were trying to move the church in the next new direction. We're trying to understand and get input and move forward with this Vision 2020 thing. So what we did is we invited everybody in the congregation to come and have a discussion on a Wednesday night around a meal. People would break up in little core groups. The people who showed up were that 20%. They're the ones who cared the most. They were the ones who were engaged and involved. But the invitation was sent to everybody. So there was no the walls were porous. People come. Everybody could come. Everybody was welcome. We invited people. We wanted everybody there. Those who showed up were mostly, for the most part, that 20%. So it's not just like communicating to them and not others, but it's making sure that they are part of the process. So the session wasn't just saying, here's our vision, we're going to move forward, this is where we're going, everybody get behind it, but here's what session thinks. We are inviting the core group to give us input and talk about it, and then together the session will move forward with that core group. Does that make sense? Okay. So many churches have a basic 101 membership class, a new members class. Is there a 201 or a 301 class or a 401 class to move people from just becoming new members of the congregation, but to invite them to be more involved in the ministries, in leadership, helping discern them beyond that just welcome to the church. Here's how to give. And this is a whole other section. New member cultivation. Churches are often reluctant to, how long do we go? Till 12? 11:45?
Yeah, until 12.
Okay. So churches are often reluctant to talk with new members about stewardship. We sometimes, I heard it a lot in my church in Florida. We don't want to invite them to stewardship. We just want to invite them to be part of the church, to join us. But the research shows that people want to know how to be good stewards in the congregation. There's something about the congregation, there's something they really like about the church. If they're willing to say, I want to go through a new member class, and I want to become a member of your congregation, they like the congregation. They are invested. That is the perfect time for it to say, here's how you can become invested in this congregation more fully than just showing up on a Sunday morning. How can we help them grow as faithful stewards? This is another point too. We're not just trying to get them to become members of the church. We are trying to grow disciples of Christ. So how do we do that more broadly, more than just saying, come to worship on a Sunday morning? But how can we help them to become stewards and disciples where they are able to use all of their God-given gifts to help further the congregation? So how does a person become a member? What are the expectations? Does the church have a plan for involving new members more deeply in the church through ministry, discipleship, volunteerism, stewardship? I think it's a great disappointment if someone joins a congregation, they go through a new member class, and then they feel like, I don't know what else to do. I don't know how else to get involved. Like I said before, if they're willing to say, there's something about your congregation that attracted them, if they're willing to become a member. So let's invite them to be a full member of the congregation. Does the church spend time discussing and defining stewardship with new members? How does the church define good stewardship to new members? Does the church track the giving trends of new members? The next one. Does the church have a strategy for encouraging a first gift? What is the established procedure for recognizing and saying thank you for that first gift? What about a strategy for a second gift or a pledge? What I've been taught is that a thank you for that first gift should come within 7 days, no later. If somebody's giving for the first time, that's another time they're kind of saying like, hey, look at me. I like you guys. I want to be involved. How can I get involved? Yes?
I want to ask, on the training that you put in the previous slide, says training 101, 102 or so. Is there, can you elaborate on that, or is there a roadmap or some examples you can share with us?
Sure, New Members 101 would be something like, it's a new members class, here's what it means to be a Presbyterian. We have elders who are part of the session, some churches have deacons who do various ministries, we have a pastor who's ordained, that's a Presbyterian, we're part of a larger denomination, here's how the presbytery, the synod, the denomination works. If you want to be a new member, we have worship service on these dates. That's a typical kind of new member class. And then here's a pledge card sometimes at the end, sometimes not. A 201 member class might be more like, it doesn't have to be separate classes. It can be one class that's more intense, but not more than just how do you attend as a consumer of a Sunday morning worship service, but how do you start to participate in a congregation by sharing? Here's some leadership opportunities. Here's some volunteer opportunities. Some kind of intentional invitation. So there might be some kind of intentional program where there's a church in Wisconsin where every time there's a new member, there was someone from the elders who had coffee with that new member to learn about what are they passionate about, what are they interested in, how would they like to serve, and sharing with them ways that they can share that in the congregation. Sometimes I think when we're in a church, we know a lot what's going on in the congregation, so we know how we can get involved, where we can volunteer. Someone who's new to the congregation has a much more difficult time of knowing where they can get involved and plugged in to the ministry. So that's what I mean by the 301, 401 class. How can you foster a deep
Yeah, I think that the first section in like 101, 102 area. Pastor Ann have been doing great in that. I was just wondering on more like the letter numbers. So thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay, communication. This was brought up earlier. Communication is a huge key of all this. Churches often talk about money only when the church is asking for more money, such as during stewardship campaigns or when immediate financial needs arise. The problem will continue to plague the church until church leadership finds new helpful ways to communicate about money and stewardship with no ask attached. What would happen if we began to regularly communicate to people so that they are able to see and understand the real impact of their giving? Most church members may not understand the actual impact that their giving has on ministry. Create opportunities to celebrate ministry impact and talk about money without asking for money to help donors understand the impact of their giving. Every church spends a great deal of communication energy promoting ministries and activities. Does the church spend a relatively equal amount of time closing the loop by communicating results and impacts of those ministries and activities? I think one problem, I don't know if your church has it or not, but it may. Churches with endowments sometimes have a problem where people think that the endowment provides all of the funds for the congregation. So why should I give? Because we have all this money in our endowment, there's no need for me to give. This is where communication, if it's done effectively and targeted, can help people understand exactly why their gift is so important. It also helps with the disclosures and the transparency of how the money is used. That can be effective in that sometimes. But how does the church communicate the results and successes of ministries receiving financial support? Does the church share the stories of the impact and life changes made through its ministries? This one's kind of, I find this one to be difficult. Some churches, the way they approach this is by saying, we've had such and such number of baptisms in the last year, such and such number of people come to Christ in the last year. I think in my ministry context, and others, I think in the Presbyterian Church more broadly, but it's hard. This can sometimes be hard because I think the church, for me personally, the church continues to have an impact on my life every year, but it's hard to communicate that sometimes. I can't say, I came to Christ again this year. I came to Christ again this year. But there are ways to, it's kind of hard, but it's important to share the impact and how their money is making a difference. Does the church regularly and personally say thank you for giving? This is the fifth or sixth time we've seen this thank you show up in this presentation. Does the church spend as much time thanking as asking? Or if there are designated offerings, is there a follow-up to help donors see the impact of their giving? Data analysis. I'm going to brush through this one because it's kind of a boring one, but also run out of time. But data analysis. So does the church track giving trends more specifically than broad strokes per member and attendee? How do we understand our data? Does the church track core giving trends, the top 20%, and movement into and out of the core giving category? So there are. This is also kind of a controversial one. There are many churches, and I was in one, where the stewardship committee did not want the pastor or anyone else to know. The only person who knew the giving trends was the church finance, I forget her title, but the church finance staff person, because it was confidential information. And yes, it is confidential information. It should be treated that way. But there's another way to look at it too, in that if someone's giving changes significantly, there may be an opportunity there because that person may need some pastoral support from the pastor, from the congregation, from the deacons. Or if someone is really boosting their income in a certain time, that too may be an opportunity for that person to be engaged more in ministry. They may be saying through their giving, I really like what's going on in this congregation. I want to increase my support because I really think what's going on here is good. If no one in church leadership knows that except the finance staff person, I could see that person saying, I'm giving of my time, and there's no one recognizing that. No one else knows that I'm stepping up, and I want to be a part of this. So, I mean, lots of questions here about, privacy and people's privacy, and who knows and how knows. But one thing I heard is that one of the arguments for a pastor this is just for a pastor, but one of the arguments for a pastor not knowing about giving is that they didn't think the pastor would handle that information in a respectable way. Well, if your pastor is not going to handle that information in a respectable way, you've got bigger problems with the pastor than just that information. But also, I think if a stewardship team, there are ways for, if there's a stewardship committee or a stewardship team, there are ways for them to know some of this information, who's been in and who's out. There could be the names removed and only the pastor knows the names, or maybe a select few. I mean, there's lots of ways to do this. But I think there is a way that we can track our data better as a way of understanding who's potentially in need of some care from the church and who's stepping up and saying, I want to lead more. How can I be led more?
Have you ever used targeted communications?
Targeted communications.
Yeah, as opposed to a general stewardship letter, tailored it to the individual.
I know some have done that. Some congregations have done that. The closest that I've done to that is that when we had a capital campaign, we knew some in the congregation who had significant financial leadership opportunities and invited them to give as kind of seed money for a specific project. So that's the closest that I personally have done to that. But I've heard of some churches who do targeted things. It can be done. I think there's a risk sometimes of who feels left in, who feels in, who feels out. Is there an in group? Is there an out group? I mean, sometimes it can be good to target people because some people have financial leadership potentials, while some other people have pastoral leadership potential, others have music leadership potential, and we don't communicate with them all the same way. We have to be careful, though, about is there an in-group and an out-group making decisions behind closed doors. I don't know if that addressed that at all.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the case where somebody gives the same amount every year, year in and year out for 10 years, and could you, in a letter to them during the stewardship campaign, just ask them to consider faithfully increasing their donation? Or do you think that could backfire?
I think if it's, in that case, my opinion would be it might be too targeted. That's my opinion. Somebody might feel like they're being singled out as not giving to their potential. And who's the church to know my potential? Thoughts off the top of my head.
Pastor Jason?
Yes?
It seems a little bit difficult. We're deep into lots of great ideas. But if we collectively don't have many insights, it becomes almost impossible to execute many of these.
Yeah, and I think,
Almost all of them.
yeah, and I think you're right. And this resource that I've designed is, the intent is no church can do all of these things well at one time. So it's kind of discerning, where do we think we have the most potential? If there's no sense of where that is, I would probably start personally with communication and thank yous.
And even on the thank you, taken literally with what you've just said, without that information known, when a new member pledges or pays for the first time, and that gets to the right person within 7 days, which I agree with.
Mm-hmm.
But there has to be a belief that everyone involved can be trusted.
So-
And I'm not saying involve everyone,
Mm-hmm.
but those involved can be trusted. And it can go the other way too. To Stafford's point, if someone has given for a giving unit, has a history of giving and then all of a sudden stops, and no one checks in on them, they'll wonder what's going on. And the reason they stopped may be a difficulty in their lives, or it can be a withholding because they're upset about something. And if that's not acted on, they may reach conclusions that aren't correct, actually.
Yeah. I thank you for your point. I see that if someone's going to give for a first time and there's a thank you to go out, someone has to know that person gave for that first time. If someone stops giving and someone's going to reach out, someone has to know that person stopped giving. So it's a difficult conversation about in the church about who's going to know that information and how much of that information is going to be known. I don't think there's a flat across the board answer to that. A lot of it goes to institutional history and institutional trust. If there's not a culture of trust and transparency in a congregation, I could see a lot of resistance to sharing information more broadly. So I think it is a very big issue, but information has to be shared, but there has to be a conversation of trust around that as well, and an institutional history of trust. And then planned giving, we're running out of time here. Planned giving, I think from what I've seen from what you do this quite well. You have a planned giving set up and invitations that go out. So I think from what I've seen on the surface, you do this pretty well. And then stewardship education, again, we're talking about stewardship information. So so a sample ministry plan, can we click on that link and see if it pulls up?
And Jason, I would imagine this is so compelling, you're doing such a great job. I would imagine people wouldn't mind staying another 5 or 10 minutes if
Okay.
keep going.
Okay, if you need to leave, feel free to walk out. I won't take any offense at all. But we only have 3 slides left, and they're kind of these resources that you to help flesh this out a bit. Sure, if you could start at the top page. So this is kind of a combination of 2 things to show you. It's a ministry plan. It's also sometimes called a narrative budget. I'm not sure if you all, maybe you've done narrative budgets or ministry plans before, but this is one I thought that was done pretty well. So it's by a church called Long Hollow. It's a ministry plan. And if you could scroll down maybe 2 pages, so a letter from the pastor, another. Let's go back to the orange one. So this is kind of summarizing what's their ministry plan, where they're going to use the money for the next year. You can scroll down a page. So that's kind of breaking these out. So Long Hollow is compelled to go global with the gospel. So instead of just saying, like on a spreadsheet, here's our missions budget, it's $1.1 million. It's saying, it's this whole page. It's much more compelling. It's showing this is our vision of what we're going to do with this money. It's not just that we're inviting people to give to our ministry budget of $1 million, but we're inviting people to give to this part of the world, these parts of the world. Your faithfulness, so that your impact, your faithfulness enables us to do these things. So it's not just you're giving to a budget, you're giving to a goal, to a thermometer. Your faithfulness is accomplishing these things right here. This is what you're giving to do. If you could scroll down to the next page, please. So this is another area of their budget. This is for the help the hurting. So it's not just giving to a deacon's fund or a pastoral care budget, but your money is helping the hurting. You are accomplishing something by giving your money to this fund. Your giving, again, it enables us to do these things. So you are doing these things when you give to this fund. If you could scroll down again, please. Again, worship and life together. So again, you can see the pattern here. Your giving accomplishes, you do these things when you give. You don't just give to the church. You don't help the church accomplish a goal. You are accomplishing these things when you give. If you could scroll down. Yeah, so the next generation, increasing ministry capacity, but the whole thing is kind of like this. But the compelling thing is, it looks nice, of course, but I think the most compelling thing is that by giving, you are joining us in this vision, and you are accomplishing these things. It's not we, the church. It's not the church that's accomplishing these things. It's not the ministry committee. It's you as a donor are contributing these things when you are part of this. Thanks. If you go to the next slide back in the presentation, then they have the typical step up thing at the end. Stuart, okay, if you can click on that, please. And I think if you go to the second page. Yeah, all the way down to that purple box there. Thanks. So this is. So I like the idea of all church committees having a job description for the committee, where you outline exactly. It outlines a lot of things, but it's important for the committee to know what has the session authorized that committee to do on its own, and what does that committee need to come back to session in order to get permission from session to do that. It creates organizational alignment. It prevents the committee from going rogue. It helps clarify roles and expectations. It also talks about on the top page. It talks about mission of the committee, what you're supposed to do. These are specific tasks that you're supposed to accomplish. But then this one has a neat thing here: is key questions for your stewardship committee. So when you get together as a stewardship committee, which, side note, I think a stewardship committee should be its own committee. It shouldn't be like a subset of the finance committee that meets September through October or something. I think it should be a year-round stewardship committee that this is their responsibility. And so, but here's some key questions to help this stewardship committee understand what their purpose is as a committee. What is our mission as a stewardship committee? Why are we here? What are we doing this quarter to grow people in their serving, giving, and caring? Not just about money, it's about all things. What does our stewardship calendar look like? Who is asking whom for what? What's the term? Bake sale fundraising, I think is the term. Somebody introduced it to me recently, but it's where you have the youth group on Sunday come up and say, hey, we're trying to raise money for our trip this summer. The next week you have the women's group come up and say, hey, we're trying to raise money for this event. And then the next week you have the men's group come up and say, hey, we're trying to raise money for this. We have all these, somebody called it a bake sale fundraising, I think, because you're trying to get people to buy different things. But so it's important, I think, to coordinate who is asking whom for what. And it also goes back to the thanking 7 times before we ask again. Number 7, how are we celebrating our successes? Again, the thank you, the communication, here's your impact. Do we have a good case presentation for donors? But something like this I think is great for committees to have. And the last one, I don't think we'll click on it, but because it's a video, but stewardship impact video. So congregation in Georgia, they didn't do everything well in stewardship, but one thing they did do well is that in the annual campaign, they had church members, as diverse as they could, come up and give a minute information about how this church has impacted their lives this year, and to thank people for giving. So it's not just coming from the pastor, it's not just coming from session. Here's a student, yeah. But it's individual. I mean, just click somewhere in the middle. It might. But this is a student who just kind of sharing her history about how.
You may be wondering what I am constantly wondering, which is, Cassidy, why do you do so much with yourself? And let me answer that for you. I always pinpoint, or when I think about sort of the start of where I started volunteering in this church, I go back to a time, summer of 2021, which, you know, we were still kind of in the middle of the pandemic, and all of us had our own things that we were struggling with during that time. And for me, I was stuck in a pretty deep well of depression and anxiety. And there were a multitude of factors that contributed to that. But one of the main ones was sort of a lack of a faith community in my life at the time. And I remember asking Vicki to meet over at Iron Bank. We got lunch, had coffee, and I spilled out all of my emotional guts all over to her, which she graciously listened. And that's where I decided to start giving my time to the church.
Okay, you can stop there. So you can see here what she's doing is she's sharing personal story about how the church has had an impact on her. And then she goes on to say, your giving to this congregation has made this possible in my life. Things like that. And this congregation, they do a series of like, 4 to 8 people, one Sunday a week. Just, I think hers is long, it's 6 minutes. Most of them are like 2 or 3 minutes. And they try to get someone, variety. So she's a young college student. They'll get someone who's in her 90s, who's been in this congregation for like 60 years, and say, this church has meant so much to me. But again, it's closing the loop. It's inviting people to be part of the mission. It's inviting people to see how the impact they're giving, these types of things that I think are compelling. And I think that might be the last slide in the... Okay, thank you. So that's, we went over a lot today. And like I said, no church can do all these things well all the time. And there are different, some of them are controversial, some are not. But I think there's an opportunity for any congregation to pick something in there. Give it a try, see how it goes. And I think I think, I'm getting on my soapbox, but I think one thing is we in the church need to not be afraid of failure. If we try something and it doesn't work, we know that thing doesn't work, we move on to something else. It doesn't mean we failed, doesn't mean we're doomed. We tried it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, try something else. So that's all I had. Ann?
I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you.